violent land appropriation. And I'm putting in the mix payment for the land also. Because I will show the evidence that in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines that I have, which I've presented already in a paper, that the British government sold the lands and deposited the money in the British Treasury. I want that money. Beckles goes on. The use of military power to defeat native communities was matched with a mentality that made possible their extermination when met with resistance. At the outset, the natives were considered undesirable and dispensable. War was unleashed upon these communities with a view to seizing their land and labor. If they could be enslaved, then the added bonus was welcome. The English state sanctioned this policy and financed its operations. State and private sectors joined together in the hope of massive material reward, unquote. Beckles provides chapter and verse to substantiate each limb of these conclusions. In the first phase of conquest, extirpation of the natives and attempted settlement by the English. In this first phase, the native population in the Lesser Antilles fell between 1492 and 1730 by as much as 90%, according to the distinguished English historian of the Caribbean, Michael Curtin. After 1730, and more particularly after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War and the accompanying Treaty of Paris in 1763 between the French and the English, the extent of the genocide against all native peoples became even more ferocious. The native populations were variously described as Indians, Caribs, sometimes Arawaks, and in the countries such as Dominica, St. Vincent, and the Leeward Islands, they call themselves Kalinagos, spelled in two different ways, whom others labeled as Yellow Caribs. From the late 17th century, fully into the 18th century in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the offspring of the Kalinagos and Africans who ran away from slavery in neighboring Barbados and who survived from a shipwreck near to St. Vincent in 1670, the offspring of these two became known as the Garifuna and constituted the majority of the population until African slaves in large numbers were forcibly taken from West Africa between 1764 and 1807 to man the sugar plantation economy. The colonialists called the Garifuna Black Caribs. In every island in the Lesser Antilles, the Kalinagos and later the Garifuna people defended their lands, their patrimony from European encroachment and aggression. From time to time, the native populations adopted flexible tactics which involved negotiations and active resistance. For example, on March the 23rd, 1667, Kalinago leaders of St. Vincent, Dominica, and St. Lucia met an English delegation headed by the governor of Barbados, William Lord Willoughby, in St. Vincent to negotiate peace. At the signing of the treaty were Amwata, the Grand Baba or chief of all the Kalinagos, Chiefs Watia, Ne, Lesero, Rebura, and Alums. A one-sided treaty was signed, which gave the English essentially all they wanted: suzerainty over the island, loyalty of the Kalinagos to the King of England, and the return to Barbados of any African slave or other fugitive who fled that British colony. Willoughby intended to use the treaty as a springboard for settlement of these islands for sugar production. Within 2 months of the Kalinago-Willoughby Treaty, a party of 54 English colonists from Barbados arrived in St. Vincent to start up the settlement. Well, they were in for a surprise. The Kalinagos, the Garifunas, and the Africans resisted their presence and drove them from the island. In response, Willoughby unleashed a full-scale genocidal offensive. The Kalinagos and their allies rebuffed Willoughby's expedition, it having suffered heavy losses. Constant skirmishes and war took their toll on the Kalinagos. According to the priest observer, Father Jean-Baptiste Labat, by 1770, adult Kalinagos in St. Vincent, Dominica did not exceed 2,000. Still, their militancy and the rugged terrain of these islands restrained potential English settlers. By then, the Garifuna constituted a clear majority of the population, certainly in St. Vincent. They indeed had become hardened guerrilla fighters under their chief, Joseph Chatoyer. So by the time of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in a general Anglo-French carve-up of the West Indian territories, Britain was allocated St. Vincent, Grenadines, St. Lucia, and Tobago. Imagine that. Sort that out in Paris. They ask nobody nothing. They say, well, Britain, you take St. Vincent, Grenadines, St. Lucia, and Tobago. They had, of course, already settled Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, and Antigua in the Les Antilles. But by then, the Kalinago nation was broken through the British policy of genocide against them. So I pose this question of relevance, which Beckles himself has raised sharply. Given that the extermination of the Kalinagos had anticipated a similar later treatment of the Maori tribes in Australia, how is it that Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain had offered an official apology for that acknowledged crime against humanity, and her government paid reparations accordingly, but nothing in these respects has been offered and done for the descendants of the Kalinagos and their nation-states of St. Vincent, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and the Leeward Islands of St. Kitts, Nevis, Antigua, Barbuda. Beckles is emphatic on reparations for native genocide. He correctly observes in his book, quote, "The colonization of 3/4 of the world's people and places by Western Europe created rich opportunities for such crimes against humanity to flourish. In the Caribbean context, the genocide against the indigenous populations, the sexual plunder of their women by imperial soldiers, and the appropriation of their wealth by merchants and military leaders preceded the mass enslavement of Africans. Such crimes have had lasting and damaging effects in the psychological, material, and social conditions of those victimized and on generations of their progeny," unquote. In a paper recently authored and published by me, entitled "Preliminary Notes on the Quantification of Reparations from the British for Lands Stolen, for Genocide, for Forcible Deportation of the Garifuna people, and for Enslavement of Africans in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I have traced the contours and some specifics of all these issues in the period 1763 to 1834, from the assumption of suzerainty by the British for St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the formal emancipation of slaves." Notice the title of the paper which I've written, "Preliminary Notes on the Quantification." Because, like Lord Gifford, I want to go beyond the general talk. And later I will come to some specific issues. One of the first acts of the British colonizers in 1764 was to declare that all lands in St. Vincent and the Grenadines belonged to the British Crown. That's the first act. At one stroke, they deprived the Garifuna and the Kalinago people of all their land, which was held in common, save and except for under 2,000 acres, which the natives had allowed the French settlers to occupy and cultivate on the western side of St. Vincent. And I want you to note that my country measures 150 square miles, some 96,000 acres. 85,120 acres on St. Vincent and 10,880 acres in the Grenadines. I think you remember those little exercise book on the back? The thing, I think it's 640 acres to 1 square mile, so you can do the maths yourself. The same book which used to have, confused me after a while, you know, as I was growing up, because 1 pound was equals to $4.80. That's before you understood how the market takes it up and down. From 1764 to 1795, the Garifuna-Kalinago nation fought the British colonizers. The land issue was central to the popular native resistance to British colonization. Bit by bit, chunk by chunk, the British took the lands of the Garifuna-Kalinago people on one pretext after another. The British finally defeated the Garifuna-Kalinago nation in 1795 and in subsequent skirmishes. On March the 14th, 1795, the British ambush and massacre of the Garifuna patriots occasioned the death of the paramount chief Joseph Chatouillet. As part of our nation's historical reclamation, my government formally declared the Right Excellent Joseph Chatouillet as the first national hero of St. Vincent and the Grenadines on March 14, 2000. But I can't declare you national hero and then don't look for the money. It will only mean that I'm engaged in cosmetic activity. By 1800, the Garifuna-Kalinago people were practically quarantined on an allocated parcel of 238 acres of land in an inaccessible area of the northeast of St. Vincent. Thus, between 1763 and 1800, in mere 37 years, the Garifuna-Kalinago people lost the remainder of their 85,120 acres of land on St. Vincent and 10,800 acres in the Grenadines. In 1804, the Garifuna were legally barred from owning their land. The British government must pay for these lands, from which the British Treasury and its grantees benefited directly to the detriment of the Garifuna-Kalinago nation and their successors in independence St. Vincent and the Grenadines. For example, in 1764, this is 1 year after they were given St. Vincent in Paris, the British government auctioned 20,538 acres of land on St. Vincent. On this sale, the British Treasury earned directly at the time 162,854 pounds, an average of £7.16 per acre. Using a conservative factor of 900 to put the 1764 values in those of 2013, the figure amounts to £146.59 million today, or 612.7 million Eastern Caribbean dollars more than my annual budget. And that is only for 20,538 acres. And so for only that, I'm only dealing with a piece of the land. You see, I want the students here in the history classes and otherwise, you have to do the detail work here, because when we're making the claim, we have to have the facts. And never mind, some of it you may find boring but important. In 1764, the British government granted to General Robert Monckton, a hero of the 7 Years' War, 4,000 acres of land on the windward coast of St. Vincent. Monckton didn't settle there. He promptly sold the land for £30,000, or £27 million in today's money. Similarly, in 1777, the British government granted Lieutenant Colonel George Etherington a huge parcel of land in the northwest of St. Vincent on account of his services to the British in the American War of Independence. Likewise, for an identical reason, Colonel Thomas Brown was granted 6,000 acres of former Carrot country lands in 1807, valued then at £135,000, or 114.75 million pounds today. So I ask the question, why did the British not grant Mountain, Etherington and Brown lands in London, Cambridge, Oxford or Liverpool for their services to the British Crown? Why give them land in St. Vincent and Grenadines? They had only done disservice to the native population. I taken a little time on the native because they don't have too many representatives among the intellectual class. So they tend to get forgotten. We don't want us to forget them. Just want to say, by the way, Hillary Beckles organized money for special Garifuna scholarships at Cave Hill. And we have people from St. Vincent and Dominica who go specially from the Garifuna community to be educated at university. It is estimated by me that 64,000 acres of the land which the British stole from the Garifuna Kalinago nation is assessed in today's value at 918 million pounds, or EC $3.84 billion. You hear me? So I don't want no aid from you. Just give me my money for my land. I don't want no aid, I don't want a discussion. You know, I don't want you to supervise me to see whether I have the right procurement procedures, whether it should be for this project or that project. And by the time I sign the financing agreement, it's 7 years the project implemented, and to implement it, it's more difficult, more problematic than pulling teeth without anesthetic. Give me my money for my land which you stole. Regarding the assessment as land, regarding the assessment for genocide of the Garifuna Kalinago people, at the years 1795 to 1797, the following numbers are relevant. I want you to hear these numbers. The native population of the Garifuna and Kalinago, and most of them were Garifuna, the mixture between the Kalinago and the Africans, as I mentioned, those who ran away from Barbados and slavery. I remember, you know, Barbados was the worst place on God's earth. So don't never mind. It's a paradise today. It's one of the worst places. People used to throw themselves off a ship when they were going Barbados. The slaves. Yes, Hillary did. Recounted it in the book. Barbados was a bad word. Native population 9,000 in 1795. Estimated number killed in the war. I'm talking about the last war, which ended in 1795. Or slaughtered immediately thereafter, 2,500. Actual number who died on an inhospitable offshore island of Balisu, awaiting forcible deportation, 2,445. You see what happened? After they killed Chatelier, and they killed off a lot of people, a lot of the Garifuna, they then took nearly 5,000 of them and put them on an island offshore part of St. Vincent and the Grenadines called Baliso. It got no water. It got plenty iguana and lizard